There is a story unfolding right now that most people are not paying attention to. It is not breaking news on television every night. There are no explosions, no soldiers, no emergency press conferences. But the damage is real and it is spreading fast. It is happening quietly, inside liquor stores, behind bar counters, inside warehouses, and on factory floors where workers are starting to fear for their jobs. This is not a political theory or a future warning. This is already happening. What began as casual threats thrown out during a holiday season has turned into one of the most damaging economic mistakes in recent memory. And the worst part, the people who pushed this path and the people who stayed silent while it happened are now pretending they had nothing to do with it. Tonight on Dylan News, we are breaking down how a trade fight that was supposed to show strength ended up destroying a billion-dollar American industry, how an entire market vanished almost overnight, and how ordinary consumers, not governments, delivered a blow that may never be reversed. Stay with me because once you understand how this happened, you will also understand why there may be no way back. It started on Christmas Day. While families were celebrating, while businesses were closed, while most people were focused on anything but politics, a message was sent that changed everything. The President of the United States publicly threatened Canada with massive tariffs, 25%, not as part of a long negotiation, not after months of talks, but suddenly, loudly, and with a tone that suggested Canada should simply fall in line. And that was not all. Along with the tariff threats came comments that stunned even seasoned diplomats. Canada was mocked. Its sovereignty was brushed aside. There were jokes about it becoming the 51st state. Statements that might have sounded clever to a political base, but landed very differently across the border. This was not diplomacy, this was pressure, and pressure has consequences. What many people in Washington fail to understand is that Canada is not a weak trading partner. It is not desperate, and it is not dependent in the way some politicians seem to believe. More importantly, Canadians do not respond well to being talked down to, especially by a neighbor they have traded with peacefully for generations. At first, the reaction was quiet. There were statements from Canadian leaders pushing back. There were reminders that trade relationships work both ways, but there was no immediate explosion, no dramatic retaliation announced on day one. And that silence fooled a lot of people. Behind the scenes, something very different was happening. Provincial governments began reviewing contracts, liquor boards began reassessing suppliers, and regular consumers began talking to each other, not on official platforms, not through press releases, but in conversations, in bars, in grocery aisles, online, and face-to-face. Then, slowly, American alcohol started disappearing from shelves. Bourbon, whiskey, wine, brands that had dominated Canadian markets for decades were suddenly gone. At first, many assumed it was temporary, a political message, a symbolic move. It was not. What followed was one of the most organized consumer boycotts seen in modern trade history, and it did not require government orders. Canadians simply stopped buying American spirits, not because they were told to, but because they chose to, and they were strategic. They focused on industries closely tied to American conservative politics. Bourbon from Kentucky, spirits from regions known for supporting aggressive trade policies. This was not random anger, it was targeted economic pressure. The impact was immediate and brutal. Exports of American spirits to Canada collapsed. Not declined, not slowed, collapsed. An 85% drop in a single quarter compared to the previous year. Think about that number for a moment. That is not a dip. That is a market disappearing. For American distillers, Canada was not a side customer. It was one of the largest export destinations, a stable, reliable market that had taken decades to build. And in a matter of months, it was gone. Companies that once reported strong international growth suddenly faced earnings calls filled with damage control. Executives admitted the boycott was real, that it was hurting revenue, that it was not easing. Some tried to downplay it, others could not. Major distilleries began announcing layoffs, production slowed, warehouses filled with unsold inventory, and then came the announcements no one wanted to hear. Entire facilities shutting down. Plants that had operated continuously for generations announced year-long closures. Workers were told there was no clear timeline for recovery. Families who had depended on these jobs for decades were suddenly facing uncertainty created by a political decision they had no control over. And here is where the story gets even more uncomfortable. Many of the political leaders whose states were being hit hardest said nothing. No early warnings, no public resistance, no defense of the workers whose livelihoods depended on international trade. Silence. Only after the damage became impossible to ignore did statements begin to appear, carefully worded, late, focused on concern rather than responsibility. By then, the market had already moved on. Bars across Canada had replaced American bourbon with alternatives: Canadian whiskey, Irish brands, Scotch, Japanese bottles. Customers tried them, many liked them, some preferred them. And once a consumer changes habits, they do not automatically return. This is the part many politicians still do not understand. Trade policy can change on paper, tariffs can be lifted, agreements can be signed, but you cannot force people to buy something they no longer want. Brand loyalty, once broken, is incredibly hard to rebuild. Canadian consumers now ask where a drink comes from. They actively avoid American labels, not out of anger alone, but because they found replacements they enjoy. That shift is psychological, and psychology does not reset with a press conference. While American distillers struggle, Canada's economy tells a very different story. Job growth has exceeded expectations. Unemployment has dropped. Analysts describe momentum that few predicted during the early days of the trade dispute. The country that was supposed to fold under pressure adapted instead, and that contrast is impossible to ignore. On one side, American workers facing layoffs, shutdowns, and shrinking exports. On the other, a trading partner that diversified, adjusted, and kept moving forward. This is not just about alcohol. This is about what happens when intimidation replaces strategy, when ego replaces diplomacy, when leaders underestimate the power of consumers. Before we move further, if you want clear, fact-based breakdowns like this, make sure you subscribe to Dylan News. We cover the stories others rush past, and we explain what they actually mean for real people. Because the next part of this story goes even deeper into political miscalculations, long-term damage, and why this may only be the beginning. What makes this situation even more serious is how predictable it all was. Trade experts warned about it, industry leaders quietly worried about it, even some politicians understood the risk. But understanding does not matter if no one speaks up when it counts. For years, the American spirits industry depended on one simple assumption: Canada would always be there, a friendly neighbor, a stable buyer, a market that felt almost permanent. Deals were built around it, expansion plans depended on it, jobs existed because of it, and then that assumption shattered. When Canadian provinces removed American alcohol from store shelves, it sent a signal far beyond politics. It told consumers that alternatives existed. It told bars and restaurants that they did not need default American brands anymore. And once that door opened, there was no going back to how things were before. Large companies felt it first. Sales reports showed massive declines. Executives tried to reassure investors, but the numbers were too large to spin away. Some admitted openly that the boycott was damaging not just one quarter, but the entire year. Others warned it could last longer. Then came the shutdowns. Facilities that had been running for nearly a century announced year-long closures, not for repairs, not for upgrades, but because there was too much product and not enough demand. Thousands of workers suddenly found themselves waiting, hoping, and asking the same question: when will this end? For many, there was no answer. Smaller distillers suffered even more. These were not massive corporations with global reach. These were family-run businesses, craft producers who invested everything they had to build a name. Many had just entered international markets. Canada was their first big success, and now purchase orders stopped. Shipments were frozen, deals were paused, momentum disappeared overnight. For small businesses, momentum is survival. Once it is gone, the fall is fast. Some distilleries entered bankruptcy, others canceled expansion projects. Plans that once promised jobs and growth were replaced by court filings and layoffs. Communities that had been rebuilt around this industry began feeling the loss. All of this damage traced back to one basic mistake: the belief that trade wars only hurt the other side. That belief has always been wrong. When consumers decide to boycott, governments lose control. There is no negotiation table for personal choice. There is no tariff that forces loyalty. People buy what they want, from whom they trust. Canadian consumers felt insulted, they felt dismissed, and they responded the only way that mattered: with their wallets. What followed was a slow but powerful shift. Bars rewrote menus, stores redesigned shelves, sales staff learned new talking points, customers stopped asking for American bourbon by default. Instead, they asked questions. Where is this from? Who makes it? Is there a local option? That habit change is deadly for brands built on familiarity. American bourbon was not just a drink in Canada, it was a symbol, a cultural export, something expected. Once it became controversial, it lost its advantage. Meanwhile, political leaders who should have protected these industries reacted far too late. Some eventually issued statements, some expressed concern, a few acknowledged that trade wars were hurting workers back home. But notice the timing. These comments came after shutdowns, after layoffs, after billions in lost trade. That is not leadership, that is damage control. Workers were left asking why no one spoke up earlier, why warnings only came after donors complained, why protecting pride mattered more than protecting jobs. The hardest part of this story is the human cost. These workers did not threaten Canada. They did not write policy. They did not insult a neighboring country, yet they are the ones paying the price. Families now face uncertainty because a political message was delivered without thinking through the response. Mortgage payments do not pause during trade wars. Health insurance does not wait for negotiations. Bills arrive on time, even when paychecks do not. And while this unfolds, something else becomes clear. Canada did not collapse. Job growth exceeded expectations, employment improved, the economy adjusted, businesses found alternatives, the country moved forward, not backward. This contrast exposes the failure at the heart of the strategy. Pressure was supposed to create submission. Instead, it created independence. And independence is permanent. Once a market rebuilds itself without you, it does not rush to invite you back, even if tariffs end tomorrow, even if leaders shake hands, even if apologies are offered. Trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild, if it ever does. In the next part, we are going to look at the political silence that allowed this to happen, who stayed quiet, who benefited, and why this may reshape how other countries deal with the United States going forward. To really understand how this situation spiraled, you have to look at what did not happen. There were moments when this could have been stopped, moments when powerful voices could have stepped in and said, "This is going too far." That did not happen. Instead, there was silence. Political leaders whose states depended heavily on exports watched the threats unfold and chose not to respond. They understood the risk. They knew Canada was a key market. They knew retaliation was possible. Yet, they stayed quiet. Why? Because speaking out carried political risk. Challenging aggressive trade rhetoric meant challenging power. And for many, protecting their position mattered more than protecting the workers they represented. Only after the consequences became unavoidable did concerns surface. Suddenly, there were interviews, carefully chosen words, statements about free and fair trade, acknowledgements that entire industries were being harmed. But by then, Canadian consumers had already moved on. This delay is critical to understand. Markets react faster than politics. Consumers do not wait for elections. Businesses do not pause losses while leaders debate messaging. By the time political concern appeared, the damage had already become structural. Bars had rewritten supply chains, distributors had signed new contracts, shelf space had been reassigned, training had shifted toward non-American brands, and the longer this lasted, the deeper those changes settled. There is another misunderstanding at the center of this story. The idea that once a deal is signed, everything returns to normal. That is not how consumer behavior works. When people are pushed to try something new, they often discover they like it. Canadian consumers did not just tolerate alternatives. Many embraced them. Some found better price points. Others preferred the taste. And many liked the idea of supporting local or non-American producers. That preference now exists independently of politics. Even if American bourbon returned to every shelf tomorrow, it would be competing from a weaker position. No longer the default, no longer unquestioned. This is the kind of loss that does not show up fully in quarterly reports. It shows up over years. And while American producers struggle to recover, other countries are paying attention. They are watching how quickly alliances can be strained, how easily threats can replace cooperation, how fast markets can adapt away from American goods. This has consequences far beyond alcohol. Why build long-term dependence on American exports if political shifts can turn friendly trade into hostility overnight? Why invest deeply when consumer backlash can erase decades of brand building in a single year? These questions are now part of global calculations, and that should worry anyone who cares about American workers, because when trust erodes, replacement follows. And once replacements are established, leverage disappears. What happened with spirits is a warning, not just about tariffs, but about tone, about respect, about understanding that national pride matters as much as pricing. Threats may create headlines, but they also create resistance. And resistance, when shared by millions of consumers, is stronger than any policy. As this trade conflict continues, American companies face a harsh reality. They are fighting not just economic barriers, but emotional ones. Winning back a market now means winning back goodwill. That is much harder, and it raises a final question that cannot be ignored. If this is the damage done to one industry in 1 year, what happens if this approach continues across others? Because the lesson here is clear. Consumers remember how they are treated, countries remember disrespect, and markets do not forgive easily. In the final part, we will look at what comes next, why this may be permanent, and what this story ultimately says about power, miscalculation, and consequences. What happens next is the hardest part to accept, because there is no clean ending to this story, no quick fix, no simple reversal. This is not a switch that can be flipped back on. The damage that has been done lives in habits, not policies. It lives in consumer choices, not press releases, and that makes it far more difficult to undo. American producers are now facing a long road. Even if trade tensions cool, even if tariffs are rolled back, even if leaders change their tone, none of that guarantees a return to what once was, because the market moved on. Canadian distributors found new partners, bars built new identities, consumers formed new preferences, and those preferences are now normal, familiar, comfortable. That is the quiet power of consumer behavior. You can pressure governments, you can negotiate treaties, but you cannot command loyalty once it is lost. For American workers, this reality is painful. They did everything right. They showed up, they worked, they built products that were respected around the world, and they lost ground because of decisions made far above them. This is how economic fallout really works. Not in abstract numbers, but in real lives. In families adjusting budgets, in communities watching long-standing employers shrink, in skills passed down through generations suddenly feeling uncertain. And while this happens, the political lesson remains largely unlearned. Aggression is not strength. Loud threats are not strategy. Respect matters, especially with allies. The assumption that pressure always produces compliance has been exposed as false. Sometimes pressure produces independence, and independence removes leverage completely. This trade conflict will be studied for years, not because of how it started, but because of how it unfolded. A case where consumers, not governments, delivered the most lasting blow. A case where silence from leadership allowed damage to compound. A case where pride outweighed prudence. And a case where one industry paid the price for a broader failure of judgment. The spirits market will survive. Some companies will adapt. Some will consolidate. Others will disappear. That is how markets work. But the lost trust, that is harder. What happened here should serve as a warning. Not just for one country, not just for one industry, but for anyone who believes that power comes from intimidation rather than cooperation. Because the world is watching, markets are watching, consumers are watching, and once they decide to walk away, no deal can force them back. That is the real cost of miscalculation. This was not just a trade dispute, it was a lesson in consequences, and it is one that will echo for a long time.